The Grand Duchy of Ashenvale stood as a monument to old power and older pride. Its stone walls had weathered 3 centuries of storms, wars, and the rise and fall of lesser houses. Within those walls, Duke Aldrich Ashenvale moved through gilded corridors with the certainty of a man born to command, his every step echoing the weight of ancestral duty that pressed upon his shoulders like an invisible crown. He was 32 years old, handsome in the sharp-featured way of his lineage, with gray eyes that could freeze a man's blood or ignite a woman's desire. Those eyes, however, had not been cold 3 months ago when they had gazed upon Linda Whitmore in the Manor's rose garden under a summer moon. Linda was a maid, though calling her merely that diminished what she truly was. At 24, she possessed a gentleness that seemed to soften the very air around her, and an intelligence that flickered behind warm brown eyes like candlelight in a welcoming window. She had served in Ashenvale Manor for 6 years, invisible as all servants were meant to be, until the night the Duke had found her reading poetry in the library, his poetry, a leather-bound collection he thought no one knew existed. Their romance had been a secret garden of stolen moments, midnight conversations, hands brushing as she served his evening tea, a kiss in the shadowed alcove near the eastern wing. For 12 glorious weeks, Aldrich had allowed himself to be simply a man rather than a title, and Linda had dared to dream that love might transcend the iron bars of social class. She had been a fool. Now on this gray October morning, Linda stood in the Duke's private study, her hands trembling as they rested protectively over her still flat stomach. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, scents that once meant comfort but now felt suffocating. Behind his massive oak desk, Aldrich stood rigid, his face a mask carved from ice. "You're certain?" His voice was clipped, controlled. "Yes, Your Grace." The formal address tasted like ash on her tongue. "The physician in the village confirmed it yesterday. I am with child, your child." Aldrich turned away, staring out the tall window that overlooked his manicured gardens. In the distance, workers prepared the grounds for tomorrow's engagement celebration. Lady Victoria Pemberton, daughter of the Earl of Westmark, would arrive with her family to formalize their union, a strategic marriage that would unite 2 powerful houses and secure trade routes to the northern territories. Everything had been arranged for months. Everything was now impossible. "This cannot be," he said finally, his voice hollow. "The engagement is tomorrow. The contracts are signed. The alliance—" "I know," Linda's voice cracked. "I know what this means for you, Aldrich. I'm not asking you to." "Don't." He spun around and she saw something dangerous flashing in those gray eyes. "Don't use my name. Not now, not anymore." The words struck her like a physical blow. Linda stumbled back a step, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "I only came to tell you because you deserve to know. I thought perhaps we could find some arrangement. I could go somewhere distant, and you could provide modest support until—" "Until what?" Aldrich's laugh was bitter. "Until the child is born, until someone notices the resemblance, until scandal reaches Lady Victoria's ears and destroys everything I've worked to build." "Everything you've worked to build?" Linda's despair suddenly crystallized into anger. "What about what we built? What about those promises you made in the garden? You said you loved me. You said—" "I said what any man says in the heat of passion." Aldrich's voice rose, and Linda saw the exact moment he chose duty over love, watched his features harden into the imperious mask of the Duke. "I am a nobleman, Miss Whitmore. The weight of my house, my people, my legacy, it rests on my shoulders. I cannot throw it all away for a dalliance with a servant." The words hung in the air like poison. Linda felt something inside her chest shatter, pieces falling away until she wondered if she would ever feel whole again. But beneath the heartbreak, a fierce maternal protectiveness was already taking root. "A dalliance," she repeated quietly. "Is that all it was to you?" Aldrich wouldn't meet her eyes. "It was a mistake, one I intend to correct." Before Linda could respond, the study door opened. The head butler, Mr. Jameson, entered with careful neutrality, though his kind eyes flickered with sympathy toward Linda. Behind him stood two manor guards. "Your Grace," Jameson said softly. "As you requested." Linda's blood turned cold. "Aldrich, what is this?" The Duke finally looked at her, and the stranger she saw wearing his face terrified her more than any words could. "Miss Whitmore, you are dismissed from service at Ashenvale Manor, effective immediately. You will leave the grounds within the hour." "You're throwing me out." Linda's voice rose in disbelief. "I have nowhere to go. I have no family, no savings." "That is not my concern." Aldrich moved to his desk, withdrawing a small leather purse. He tossed it toward her. It landed at her feet with an insulting clink of coins. "There. Consider it severance for your years of service. It should be more than adequate." Linda stared at the purse as if it were a serpent. "Adequate? I'm carrying your child." "A child conceived out of wedlock by a servant," Aldrich said, each word carefully enunciated. "If you attempt to claim otherwise, if you ever speak my name in connection with this situation, I will ensure you are branded a liar and a seductress. No one will believe a mere maid over a duke. You will find no employment, no shelter, no kindness in any corner of this duchy or beyond." The cruelty of it stole Linda's breath. This was not the man who had quoted poetry to her under the stars. This was not the man who had traced her face with gentle fingers and called her his salvation. This was the Duke in his purest form, power without mercy, duty without heart. "Get out." The roar echoed through the study, and Linda saw Jameson flinch. "Get out of my sight. Get out of my house. I never want to see your face again." The guards moved forward, but Linda raised her hand, stopping them with what remained of her dignity. She bent slowly, picked up the purse, and looked one last time at the man she had loved. "I hope," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, "that your grand alliance brings you everything you deserve, Your Grace. I hope you remember this moment every day for the rest of your life. And I hope that when you look in the mirror, you can still recognize the man staring back." She turned and walked from the study, her head high, her spine straight. The guards flanked her as she climbed the narrow stairs to the servants' quarters one last time, packed her few belongings into a threadbare carpet bag, and descended to the manor's side entrance, the servants' door, the only threshold she had ever been permitted to cross. As the great iron gates of Ashenvale Manor closed behind her with a resonant clang, Linda stood on the cobblestone road, alone. Rain had begun to fall, cold October rain that seemed to wash away the last 3 months as if they had never been. In the distance, she could see the gray smudge of the city, and beyond it the darker stain where the slums sprawled like a wound on the landscape. She had no family, no references for future employment, no home. Only the child growing within her and the fierce determination that burned brighter than her broken heart. Linda Whitmore turned her back on the Grand Duchy of Ashenvale and began walking toward an uncertain future, one hand pressed protectively over her belly, whispering promises to the life within. "We will survive," she vowed, "and we will never, ever beg for his mercy again." The slums of Ashenvale City had no official name. Maps simply left the area blank, as if acknowledging its existence would somehow contaminate the parchment. Here, buildings leaned against each other like drunken companions, their timber frames rotted by damp and neglect. Streets ran with refuse, and the air carried the perpetual stench of poverty, unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and desperation. This was where Linda Whitmore built her new life. The leather purse the Duke had thrown at her feet contained 30 silver coins, a fortune to some, an insult wrapped in cruelty to Linda. She spent it carefully, renting a tiny room above a tannery, buying a second-hand sewing kit, and purchasing enough food to sustain her through the difficult months ahead. Winter came hard that year. Linda's fingers bled as she stitched garments for a local merchant who paid barely enough to keep her fed. Her belly grew round despite her meager meals, and she felt the child move within her, strong kicks that reminded her she was no longer alone, that she was fighting for two now. On a freezing March night, With only a midwife from 2 doors down and a candle stub for light, Linda gave birth to a son. The moment she saw him, red-faced and wailing with impressive lungs, she understood that everything she had endured had been worth it. Then the midwife placed him in her arms, and Linda's breath caught. Gray eyes, unmistakable, piercing gray eyes stared up at her, Aldrich's eyes in a newborn's face. Adrien, she whispered, naming him after her own father, a man she barely remembered. Adrien Whitmore. She traced the infant's features with a gentle finger, seeing the Duke's sharp cheekbones already forming, the determined set of his tiny jaw. Her son would be handsome, would carry his father's face through the world like an unspoken accusation. But he would also carry Linda's heart, her values, her strength. "I will never poison you against him," Linda promised her sleeping son. "But I will raise you to be everything he is not." The years that followed were a tapestry woven from struggle and small victories. Linda's skill with a needle became known throughout the slums and beyond. She could transform rags into respectable garments, could mend torn fabric so the repair became invisible. Word spread, and eventually, middle-class merchants' wives began seeking her services, willing to venture into the slums for quality work at reasonable prices. By Adrien's 5th birthday, Linda had saved enough to rent a small cottage at the edge of the slum district, 2 rooms with a real floor and a roof that only leaked in heavy rain. It was a palace compared to the room above the tannery. Adrien grew like a weed in sunlight. By 7, he was reading from the books Linda borrowed from the city's public library, devouring knowledge with an appetite that reminded her painfully of his father. By 10, he was helping her with accounts, his quick mind calculating costs and profits faster than she could write them down. But it was his character that filled Linda with pride. Despite the poverty surrounding them, despite the hunger they sometimes endured, Adrien possessed an innate nobility that had nothing to do with bloodlines. He shared his bread with street children worse off than himself. He stood up to bullies twice his size. He treated everyone, from beggars to the merchants' wives who visited their cottage, with equal courtesy and respect. "Mama," he asked one evening when he was 11, sitting at their small table while Linda sewed by lamplight, "why do I look different from you?" Linda's hands stilled on her work. She had known this question would come eventually. "What do you mean, darling?" "My eyes, my face." Adrien touched his sharp cheekbones self-consciously. "The other children say I look like a nobleman's son. They tease me about it." Linda set down her sewing and looked at her son, tall for his age, with Aldrich's aristocratic features becoming more pronounced as childhood gave way to adolescence. She had promised herself she would never lie to him. "Your father was a nobleman," she said quietly, "but he chose his duty over us. He was not a bad man, Adrien. He was simply a weak one, and sometimes that's worse." "Does he know about me?" "Yes." Does he ever wonder about us?" Linda's heart ached at the hope in her son's voice. "I don't know, my love, but what I do know is this: we don't need him. We have each other, and we have built something real here, something honest. That's worth more than all the gold in his treasury." Adrien nodded slowly, processing this. "Do you still love him?" The question pierced Linda like a needle. Did she? The heartbreak had faded over the years, worn smooth by time and hardship like a river stone. What remained was more complicated, a mixture of old pain, lingering what-ifs, and something that might have been pity. "I love who I thought he was," she answered honestly. "But that man may never have existed." While Linda and Adrien built their life from scraps and determination, Duke Aldrich Ashenvale presided over his grand duchy from a throne of hollow victories. His marriage to Lady Victoria Pemberton had been celebrated with 3 days of festivals. The alliance had indeed secured the northern trade routes and added considerably to Ashenvale's wealth and influence. By all political measures, it was a triumph. By every human measure, it was a wasteland. Victoria was beautiful in the way a porcelain doll is beautiful, perfect, cold, and brittle. She performed her duties as Duchess with mechanical precision, hosting elaborate dinners and managing the household staff with ruthless efficiency. What she did not do, despite 13 years of marriage, was produce an heir. The physicians found nothing wrong with either of them. The priests suggested prayer. The council members whispered in corners about curses and divine punishment. Aldrich knew the truth was simpler and more damning. Their marriage bed was as cold as their hearts, and nothing could grow in such frozen soil. He found himself thinking of Linda at the strangest moments. The scent of roses would transport him back to that summer garden. A servant's laughter in a distant corridor would make him turn, expecting to see warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. At night, while Victoria slept in her separate chamber, he would lie awake and wonder. What had become of her? Had she survived? Had she? No, he forced the thoughts away. Dwelling on the past was weakness, and Duke Aldrich Ashenvale could not afford weakness. But the wondering never truly stopped. On his 45th birthday, as he sat through another tedious council meeting about succession and the lack thereof, Aldrich caught his reflection in the polished silver of a serving tray. Gray eyes stared back at him, eyes that had once sparkled with poetry and passion, now dull with the weight of years and regrets. "Your Grace, regarding the matter of an heir." Councillor Pemberton, Victoria's uncle, cleared his throat delicately. "The matter is closed," Aldrich said sharply. "My nephew will inherit if necessary." But it wasn't closed. Nothing was ever truly closed. In the dark hours before dawn, Aldrich would stand at his window overlooking the city, his gaze drifting toward the slums in the distance, toward a life he had thrown away with both hands. He told himself it had been necessary. He told himself he had made the only choice possible. He told himself these things so often they should have felt like truth. They never did. Sometimes, in his most honest moments, Duke Aldrich Ashenvale wondered if Linda had been right, if he could still recognize the man in the mirror. The answer terrified him more than he cared to admit. 13 years of separation had transformed them both. Linda into someone stronger than she had ever imagined, Adrien into a young man of remarkable character, and Aldrich into a duke who had everything except what mattered. The stage was set. The players had grown and changed, and fate, patient as ever, prepared to bring them together once more. The autumn sun hung low over Ashenvale City, painting the cobblestones in shades of amber and gold. Duke Aldrich Ashenvale's ornate carriage rattled through streets he rarely traveled, having taken an unfamiliar route to avoid construction on the main boulevard. His driver, old Thomas, navigated the narrowing lanes with increasing unease as the buildings grew shabbier, and the air took on the unmistakable scent of the slum district. "Your Grace, perhaps we should turn back," Thomas called down nervously. Before Aldrich could respond, the carriage lurched violently and stopped. A wheel had struck a deep rut, cracking a spoke with an audible snap. The Duke stepped out, irritation etched across his features, and found himself standing at the border between respectability and poverty, a street where hope came to die. That's when he heard the scream. A merchant's cart, loaded with barrels, had broken loose from its mooring on the hill above. It careened down the sloping street, gaining murderous speed, heading straight for a cluster of street children playing near a fountain. The children froze in terror, all except one, a small girl perhaps 5 years old who stood directly in the cart's path, too frightened to move. Time seemed to slow. Aldrich watched, helpless, as tragedy prepared to unfold. Then a blur of motion shattered the frozen moment. A boy, 13, perhaps 14 years old, sprinted from the side street with remarkable speed. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in several places, marking him as slum-born. He reached the little girl in 3 powerful strides, swept her up in his arms, and threw himself sideways. They hit the ground hard, rolling clear just as the cart thundered past, close enough that the wind of its passage tore at their clothes. The cart smashed into the fountain with a tremendous crash, barrels exploding in a shower of splinters and salted fish. The street erupted in chaos, people running, shouting, the little girl crying in the boy's protective embrace. Aldrich stood frozen, but not because of the near tragedy. The boy had risen to his feet, setting the child down gently, checking her for injuries with careful hands. Then he turned, and the afternoon sun illuminated his face with perfect, damning clarity. Gray eyes, sharp cheekbones, a determined jaw, the proud set of the shoulders. It was like staring into a mirror that showed Aldrich his own youth, a mirror that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist except that it did. The Duke's world tilted on its axis. His breath caught in his throat. 13 years. 13 years since he had thrown Linda out of his manor. 13 years since he had refused to acknowledge what he had done. The mathematical impossibility resolved into devastating certainty. This was his son. Adrien, Adrien, are you hurt? The voice that called out was older, rougher with worry, but unmistakably familiar. Linda emerged from the crowd, her hair now touched with gray at the temples, her face marked by years of hardship but still possessing that gentle quality that had first captured Aldrich's heart. She wore a simple dress, well-mended, and carried a basket of thread and fabric. She reached the boy, Adrien, Aldrich's mind echoed, and ran her hands over him, checking for injuries with maternal desperation. "That was incredibly foolish and incredibly brave," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't ever frighten me like that again." "I'm fine, Mama." Adrien's voice was deeper than Aldrich expected, already beginning the transition to manhood. "The little one, is she safe?" "Thanks to you." Linda pulled him into a fierce embrace. It was then that she saw Aldrich. Their eyes met across the chaotic street and the world seemed to fall away. 13 years collapsed into nothing. Linda's face cycled through a dozen emotions: shock, pain, fear, and finally, a dignified composure that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. "Your Grace," she said quietly, the formal address a wall between them. Adrien's head snapped toward Aldrich, those gray eyes, his own eyes widening with sudden understanding. The boy was intelligent. Aldrich could see him making the connections, watching his mother's face, looking at Aldrich's features, recognizing what must be true. "It's you," Adrien said softly. "You're my father." The words hung in the air like a judge's sentence. Around them, the crowd had begun to take notice. Whispers spread like wildfire. The Duke of Ashenvale here in the slums, the boy with his face, the former servant woman. Aldrich's carefully constructed world began to crumble. His voice failed him. What could he possibly say? What words existed that could bridge 13 years of abandonment? "We should go, Adrien." Linda's voice was steady, protective. She placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "No." The word burst from Aldrich before he could stop it. "Please, I need to speak with you." "You needed to speak 13 years ago," Linda replied, her composure cracking slightly. "You needed to speak when you threw me into the street. You needed to speak when your son was born. You don't get to need things now, Your Grace." "Linda, please." "Lady Victoria." Thomas's warning shout cut through the tension. A second carriage had arrived, far more elaborate than Aldrich's. From it emerged Lady Victoria Pemberton Ashenvale, resplendent in silk and jewels, her face a mask of aristocratic fury. She must have been informed of the breakdown and come to investigate. Victoria's gaze swept the scene, landing on Adrien with devastating precision. Even she could see what was impossible to deny. The boy was unmistakably Aldrich's son. "So," she said, her voice like breaking ice, "this is where all your midnight wanderings have led. This is why heaven has denied us an heir. Divine punishment for your bastard." "Careful, Your Grace." Linda's voice carried a steel that made even Victoria pause. "You may insult me as you wish, but you will not speak of my son that way." Adrien stepped forward, placing himself between his mother and the Duchess. The movement was instinctive, protective, and so perfectly noble that it made Aldrich's chest ache. "I am Adrien Whitmore," the boy said clearly, his voice carrying to the growing crowd. "My mother raised me alone with no help from anyone. She taught me that nobility is in actions, not bloodlines. She taught me courage, compassion, and honor. Whatever blood I carry, it's her teachings that made me who I am." The words struck Aldrich like physical blows. This boy, his son, possessed everything Aldrich had sacrificed for duty and honor. True nobility, earned through character rather than inherited through name. Adrien, Aldrich said, his voice breaking. I was a coward. I was weak. I chose my title over love, my reputation over responsibility. I have spent 13 years in a prison of my own making, and I don't expect forgiveness. But please let me try to make this right. How? Linda's question was simple but devastating. How do you make this right? Do you acknowledge him publicly and destroy your precious reputation? Do you offer us money and think that erases years of absence? Tell me, Your Grace, what does making it right look like to you? Aldrich looked at his son, their son, seeing the intelligence in those gray eyes, the strength in that young face. He looked at Linda, who had transformed suffering into strength. He looked at Victoria, representing everything his choice had cost him. He looked at the crowd of witnesses, at the life he had built on foundations of regret. And for the first time in 13 years, Duke Aldrich Ashenvale made the right choice. I acknowledge Adrien Whitmore as my son, he said loudly, clearly, letting his voice carry to every witness. I acknowledge my failure, my cowardice, and my debt to Linda Whitmore, who raised him alone. I cannot undo the past, but I can offer the future. Adrien, you are my heir. Linda, you deserve far more than I can ever provide, but I offer you whatever restitution you'll accept. The crowd erupted in gasps. Victoria's face went white with rage, but Aldrich kept his eyes on Linda and Adrien. I don't want your duchy, Adrien said quietly. I want to know if the man who abandoned us is capable of being the father who stays. I will spend every remaining day proving I am, Aldrich whispered, if you'll let me try. Linda looked at her son, at the question in his eyes. She thought of 13 years of struggle, of nights hungry and cold. But she also thought of the man Aldrich might have been, might still become. And she thought of Adrien, who deserved the chance to know his father, flaws and all. We will see, she said finally. But on our terms, in our world. If you want to be part of our lives, you enter them as a man, not a duke. You earn your place just as we've had to earn everything. Aldrich nodded, tears streaming down his face. Thank you. As the sun set over Ashenvale City, 3 lives converged in a moment of truth. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with scandal and struggle. But for the first time in 13 years, it was a road walked together, built on honesty rather than pride, on hope rather than duty. And in the slums where love had survived despite everything, a family began to heal.